I wasn't expecting a knock on the door that day, let alone for my neighbor Ethan to look me straight in the eyes and say, I need you to help save my sister. Hi, I'm Margot Ellison. I'm 62, widowed, and had built a quiet, steady life after years of heartbreak. But that one sentence from the man next door unraveled everything I thought I knew about comfort, boundaries, and second chances. What, for a piece of your strength? Have you ever had someone turn your life upside down with just one unexpected question? Tell me in the comments, what would you have done if you were in my shoes? A windless April afternoon drifted through the suburban neighborhood like any other day. Sunlight stretched across neatly trimmed lawns, filtered through the windows of my home, and settled on the wooden kitchen table where a cup of chamomile tea still steamed. I, Margot Ellison, 65 years old, had grown used to that quiet rhythm ever since my husband David passed away 5 years ago. I lived alone in a small cream-colored house surrounded by wisteria vines that David once tended to. Each of my days began with a cup of tea, a light classical tune, and sometimes a few lines in my journal. I no longer waited for surprises. No more anxious phone calls. No more familiar voice calling darling from the living room. Everything had gone still, like an autumn lake. That's why, when the doorbell rang in the middle of that calm afternoon, I was slightly startled. I wasn't expecting anyone, nor had I made plans. Opening the door, I found Ethan Blake, my next-door neighbor. We had exchanged greetings for years, sometimes sharing seedlings, a few lines about the weather along the shared path. But this was the first time he stood at my door with visible unease and worry in his eyes. Hello, Margot. I hope I'm not disturbing you. His voice was low and soft, different from his usual composed demeanor. Of course not, I smiled, stepping aside to invite him in. Is something the matter? Ethan stepped into the living room, glancing around as if to confirm no one else was present. As he sat on the sofa near the fireplace, I noticed his hands were slightly trembling, like he was carrying something important but difficult to express. I need a favor, a personal one. I took a seat across from him, curiosity gently rising in my chest. Then go ahead, Ethan. He took a deep breath, his eyes resting on a photo frame of David and me on the bookshelf. I know we're not that close, but I've always admired how you've stayed composed and independent after everything. I nodded lightly, still unsure of where this was going. My sister, Grace, is going through a really rough divorce. She's fragile, lost, and I thought, he hesitated. I thought if there's anyone who's ever walked through pain, who's managed to stand tall when everything fell apart, it's you. I said nothing, not from confusion, but because something within me stirred unexpectedly. In Ethan's sincere gaze, I saw a trust that wasn't performative, a man asking for help, not for himself, but for someone he deeply cared about. I can't make Grace talk to anyone, he continued, but if you'd be willing just to give her a conversation, a little hope, I would be truly grateful. I gave a gentle nod of support, or I offered a steady look of reassurance. Ethan, if you believe I can help, then I'll give it my all. His eyes softened and the worry seemed to lift just a little. I didn't know what role I was about to play in this woman Grace's life, but in that moment I knew something was about to shift, not only for her, but for me as well. Grace Blake arrived 3 days later on a rare misty morning at the beginning of spring. Ethan brought her to my doorstep, and I had already prepared 2 cups of hot peppermint tea set on the small table out on the porch. I remember my first impression of Grace clearly, thinner than I had imagined, her eyes distant, though she tried to appear strong. She wore a light brown wool coat, the cuffs slightly rolled up, revealing the pale skin of someone who hadn't slept enough. When she shook my hand, her fingers were as cold as the early morning dew. Hello, Miss Grace, I'm Margot. Hello, Mrs. Ellison, she said quietly, bowing her head as if out of habit. Just call me Margot. There's no need to be so formal here. I smiled, softening my voice. Ethan mentioned you prefer tea over coffee, so I tried to guess what kind. Grace nodded, a flicker of surprise in her eyes at the small gesture. We sat down, the warmth from the tea helping to ease the unfamiliarity between two women who had no reason to know each other were it not for a broken marriage. Ethan told me a bit. I began after a few moments of silence. You don't have to say anything if you're not ready. Grace shrugged, but her eyes lingered on the wisteria vines along the white wooden fence. I don't know what I'm doing anymore. Everything feels like it's falling apart piece by piece. Her words stopped me, not because of what she said, but because of how she said it. No tears, no drama, just a truth placed gently down, light but heavy. I remembered saying something similar myself 5 years ago, only it was to the mirror on a rainy morning. I know that feeling, I said slowly, waking up each morning and having to ask yourself, who am I now when I'm no longer someone's other half? Grace looked at me, truly looked for the first time, not past me or down at the table. Her eyes, though tired, carried an instinctive understanding. When I got divorced, I thought I'd feel relieved, she admitted. But the emptiness came faster than the sadness. I nodded, my hand still wrapped around the warm teacup. That's what no one tells us. That losing someone isn't just about losing them. It's about losing the version of ourselves that existed when we were with them. We fell silent again, but this time the silence was not awkward. It was the quiet of two women entering the same space, where pain could be heard without needing to be rushed into healing. When Ethan returned to pick up his sister, I handed her a small plant, a young lavender sprout growing in an old ceramic pot. I planted this when David passed, I said. It doesn't bloom quickly, but one day you'll find it has turned your whole porch purple without you even noticing. Grace held the pot to her chest, her eyes glistening. She said nothing, but the slow nod she gave told me everything. The first seed of hope had been planted. Grace began visiting my home more often. At first, it was just an afternoon tea once a week, then gradually turned into quiet mornings with books or late afternoons spent gardening together. We didn't talk much, but there was always something comforting between us. A kind of silence that didn't make one feel alone. I remember one early summer afternoon, sunlight slanting through the wisteria trellis, casting pale purple shadows across the old wooden porch. Grace sat in the wicker chair across from me, gently turning the lavender pot I had once given her. I never thought I could feel this kind of peace again, she said, her voice barely a whisper. All this time, it's felt like I was running away from myself. I was at my book down. You weren't running. You were just looking for a place to pause. Sometimes that's all we need. Grace smiled, faintly but genuinely. I realized that smile had become easier to find since the first day she stepped into this house. One time, she hesitantly asked, "Why did you agree to help me? We didn't know each other. I was a stranger." I looked at her, my gaze slow and reflective, as if searching through time. Because years ago, someone did the same for me. An old friend from the book club sat with me through the first 3 months after David passed. She wasn't good at talking, but she sat, and I survived because of that presence. Grace lowered her head, her palm brushing gently over the lavender leaves. I'm grateful you've sat with me too. In the days that followed, I started seeing her move more naturally around the house. She rolled up her sleeves to garden, helped me fix the old bookshelf, even brought over a few of her favorite novels to share the reading corner, as she called it. Ethan came to pick up his sister each afternoon, and it seemed that with every visit, the distance between him and me shortened just a little more. He didn't say much, but the way he looked at me was different, gentle, quiet, and deeply thoughtful. One evening, after Grace had left, Ethan stayed behind. We stood under the porch roof, watching the sun set behind the row of distant houses. "Thank you for everything," he said, his voice rough with emotion. My sister, I haven't seen her smile like that in a long time. Didn't know what to say. I just nodded quietly. Inside me, something softened too, like a gentle breeze sweeping across land that had long been dry, planting the first fragile seeds. That night, when I stepped out onto the porch to water the plants, I noticed the lavender pot Grace had brought home on her first visit. It now had tiny purple buds beginning to bloom. I sat down and smiled. A new season was arriving, slowly but surely. The next morning, as I stepped out onto the porch to water the plants, I found a neatly folded envelope placed on the small table beside the lavender pot, now budding with new growth. There was no sender's name, just two softly written words in delicate handwriting. For Margot. I opened the letter, a mix of confusion and anticipation stirring in me. It was from Grace. Underscore, 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 underscore. Um, Spoken word. So please let me borrow these few lines to express my gratitude. I don't know if you truly understand, but your home and you have become a place where I can finally breathe again. Not everyone has the patience to sit beside someone who's fallen apart, but you did, and you never asked for anything in return. I used to think that kind of kindness only existed in old books. I just want you to know, I will try. Not just for my brother, but for myself. Thank you for being the first person to tell me I don't have to be strong all the time. Grace. Underscore, 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 underscore. I set the letter down, my chest tightening. It had been a long time since anyone had written to me with such honest simplicity. Then, as if on cue, a knock came at the door. It was Ethan. Today he wore an olive-colored shirt and held a small bouquet of wild daisies in his hand. I saw these growing by the roadside and thought you might like them, he said with a slightly awkward smile. I invited him in, still moved by the letter I had just read. We sat in the living room, the morning light filtering through the glass windows, casting soft golden patterns across the wooden floor. Unlike other times, Ethan was quieter today. Grace told me about your afternoons together, he said, his gaze fixed on the flowers. She said you helped her find her breath again. I didn't think anyone could make her trust that quickly. I smiled gently. Grace isn't as fragile as she thinks. Your sister just needed a place to pause before she could move forward on her own. Ethan nodded, though he still didn't look at me. Instead, he pulled a small piece of paper from his shirt pocket and slid it toward me. Is this an invitation? I wasn't planning to impose, but I'm hosting a small gathering soon. Some old friends, a few relatives. I'd like you to come, if you'd feel comfortable. I picked up the card. His handwriting slanted slightly, but was firm. Before I could respond, he added, voice quieter now, not for Grace, for me. I want you there. For the first time, he looked directly at me, and in that look, something was no longer hidden, with calm assurance, like someone who had learned to care through hardship, but the steady sincerity of someone who had known loss and still chose to move forward. I stayed silent for a long moment, then nodded softly. I'll come. Ethan smiled, a rare smile, but a genuine one. After he left, I returned to the small table where Grace's letter had been. I gently placed the invitation card next to it. 2 pieces of paper, 2 points of connection, opening 2 paths I never expected to walk at this stage of life. I poured a fresh cup of tea. The scent of chamomile drifted through the air. It was still too early to name the feeling inside me, but I knew this. Life was inviting me to step out of the stillness I'd grown used to, through handwritten letters, through honest glances, and I was ready to listen. That evening, I stood in front of the mirror for a long time. The plum-colored linen dress I'd chosen was a birthday gift from Grace. Because you deserve something soft, she had said. I wasn't one for parties, especially after my husband's passing, but tonight, something in me urged me to go. When I arrived, Ethan's house was glowing with warm golden lights. String lights draped like falling stars across the backyard, reflecting off glasses of wine and the soft hum of laughter. Not too many people, just enough for intimacy. Ethan was standing by the buffet table, chatting with a few friends, but his eyes found me the moment I stepped inside. There was no rush in his gaze, only welcome and a quiet sense of relief. "You made it," he said as he walked over, a hint of a smile appearing. "I said I would," I replied gently. He handed me a glass of wine, then motioned for me to join him out in the backyard, where soft music filtered through branches swaying in the night breeze. The scent of baked goods mingled with lavender in the air, making the atmosphere feel tender, like a warm memory gently being touched. For a brief moment, away from the crowd, we stood side by side on the wooden deck. "I used to think I'd never have another evening like this," I said quietly, eyes gazing into the distance. "Peaceful, close enough to feel warm, but far enough not to be overwhelmed." Ethan was silent for a while. "Me too," he admitted. "After my wife passed, everything became too quiet, then too loud in my head. I thought I was just surviving." I turned to look at him. Under the golden light, his face looked calm, but his eyes carried something deeply sincere, as if those words had been held inside for a long time. "There are wounds that don't need to be spoken aloud," I whispered, "but they also shouldn't be hidden forever." He nodded slightly, then said, his voice low, "You bring calm to a house that's seen a lot of worry. Grace's and my own." I hadn't yet replied when Grace's laughter rang out behind us. She was standing with a few friends, her hair loose, her face bright. Her gaze met mine, then Ethan's. A quiet gratitude shone in her eyes. Together, we walked toward Grace. The girl who once curled into my couch now stood confidently among others, eyes glowing. As I looked at her, I realized helping someone else can sometimes be the gentlest way to begin healing yourself. And then, as if the universe wanted to mark this night with a sign of its own, a light breeze drifted through, carrying with it the scent of wildflowers and a soft whisper in my heart. The old season has passed. The next morning, I woke up with a lightness in my chest, as if a thin layer of dust that had settled there for years had finally been brushed away. Sunlight streamed through the curtains, casting its glow onto the kitchen counter where 2 wine glasses from the night before still sat unwashed. A habit I used to avoid, but today I wasn't in a rush to clean up. Some things deserved to linger just a little longer. Since Ethan and Grace entered my life, the house no longer felt too large, nor too quiet. The changes weren't loud. A meal shared, a flower Grace left by the window, a morning message from Ethan, but they made me feel alive, not merely continuing. That afternoon, while I was trimming dried lavender in the garden, Grace pushed open the gate and walked in. She was holding a small potted plant, sunlight falling gently across her tousled hair. "I thought you could use a little more green," she smiled, placing a pot of purple wild daisies into my hands. "Thank you," I said, touched by the thoughtfulness. "I'm relearning how to plant the things I once thought had died." Grace didn't ask anything more. She simply sat down beside me, her hands gently helping me tie up the flower bundles. We didn't talk much, but that made me feel more at ease, as if the silence between us was its own kind of quiet understanding, one that didn't need explanation. A few days later, Ethan knocked on my door with a basket full of homemade bread and a small handwritten note. "In return for that cup of tea and for the things you didn't know you were giving," I smiled, my heart tightening just a little. That evening, I invited him to stay for dinner, not out of politeness, not out of pity, but because I wanted to. And he agreed without saying much, just nodded and rolled up his sleeves to help me cook. We didn't need to say we were starting over. The small changes kept unfolding each day, a brief touch, a glance that lingered, a silence that was no longer uncomfortable, but comforting, like 2 quiet streams merging, not rushed, not declared, just choosing to flow together. I still don't know what lies ahead, but I've begun to believe that not all closeness means falling in love. Sometimes it just means finally feeling seen, that some people don't arrive to replace anyone, but to remind you that you can still feel. You can still begin again. And sometimes that is enough. That night, as Ethan and I sat on the back porch, the moonlight gently fell across the old wooden eaves. The breeze carried the scent of fresh grass and the faint chill of approaching cold. I brewed 2 cups of peppermint tea, the kind he once said he liked as a child, and placed one in front of him. "Thank you for letting me get this close," Ethan said, his eyes fixed on the distant sky where the trees swayed under the weight of night. "I didn't think I deserved this kind of peace." I stayed silent for a moment. "I used to feel that way too," I said honestly. That all I had left were memories and responsibilities, that the softest part of me had gone with David. His name still brushed a tender place in my heart, but for the first time, I could speak it without feeling a sharp ache. Ethan said nothing, just rested his hand lightly on the table. His presence felt like a quiet affirmation. Nothing more was needed. He understood. We sat there, needing no words to fill the silence. The small sounds, the hum of insects, the rustling leaves, were enough to make the space feel warm, alive. "I used to think," Ethan said softly, "that I'd never have the chance to love anyone again. After the marriage, after the loneliness and self-blame, I got used to not needing anyone." I turned to look at him. In the moonlight, his face revealed all its wariness, but also a raw sincerity that pierced me. "But then you showed up," he continued, "not loud, not hurried, just present. And I started to feel something soften inside me." I paused, surprised by how deeply his words resonated, a part that had been quiet for a long time. Not locked anymore, but not yet ready to swing wide open. I was still afraid, afraid of losing, afraid to love again and lose again. "Ethan," I began, my voice trembling, "I don't know if I'm ready, but I do know I want to try. Not to replace David, but to open up to something new, a part of my life I thought had already closed." He looked at me, eyes filled with quiet understanding, his eyes glowing with a mix of joy and emotion. "I don't need a promise," Ethan said. "Just don't close your heart again. I'll be patient." For the first time in years, I sat beside someone who understood the ache of loss and how to move gently forward, and understood, but because I wanted quiet beside someone who understood me. The night sky felt unusually wide, and in that moment, I knew my heart was beginning to find a new season. The next morning, I woke earlier than usual. Sunlight thin as silk stretched across the windowsill and into the living room where I often sat alone reading. But today, I didn't feel lonely. There was something very light blooming inside me, like a sprout just breaking through the soil after quietly enduring the cold. Ethan arrived carrying a basket of tangerines from his garden and that familiar smile. He walked into the kitchen as if it was something he'd always done. Not awkward, not imposing, just simply present. "I know you like fruit in the mornings," he said, placing the basket on the wooden table. "Today I didn't bring a reason. Just wanted to be here." I nodded, my heart softening. We didn't talk much. I made tea. He helped me slice the bread. Small gestures, but something familiar was growing between us. Quietly and naturally. Grace stopped by around noon. Her face was radiant, her eyes brighter than the first time I met her. She hugged me tightly. "You have no idea how much you've helped me," Grace said, her voice filled with emotion. "And I think Ethan is more grateful than he lets on." I smiled, sensing Ethan looking at me from behind, his gaze warm and steady. After lunch, when everyone had gone, I sat alone on the porch. The spring breeze carried the scent of fresh soil, fragrant and full of promise. I opened the old journal I kept in the drawer and wrote, "All beautiful things begin with something small. A cup of tea, someone who listens, a silence shared." I used to think the door to my heart was closed. But it turns out it was only waiting for the right knock. Thank you, Ethan. And thank you, myself, for being brave enough to keep living, for never giving up on hope. I closed the journal, stood up, and walked into the kitchen where Ethan was tidying up. He looked up, that familiar spark in his eyes. "This afternoon," I said, "shall we go for a walk?" Ethan smiled. "As long as you want to." And so we went. No hand-holding, no promises of far-off tomorrows. Just the first steps together in a new chapter. A gentle beginning. And this time, I believed it was real. There are things in life that arrive unexpectedly. A timely knock at the door, someone in need of help, or simply a quiet moment shared. Margot had thought her heart had closed after loss, but Ethan and Grace unknowingly touched the gentlest parts of her, the parts still alive, still longing for connection. This story isn't about passionate love or miraculous transformations. It's about healing, slow and sincere, about listening to someone, about allowing oneself to soften even after being wounded. If you've ever felt lonely, if you've ever believed that your meaningful days were behind you, remember this. Maybe what you need is just one honest conversation, one hug with no explanation, one presence steady enough to remind you you can still begin again. Have you ever met someone who softened your heart? Don't hesitate to share your story in the comments. Who knows, someone out there might be waiting to hear exactly what you have to say.